Hello and a very good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this WTM London virtual live session this afternoon called The Long Run Evolution of Aviation Activity Following the Coronavirus Pandemic. My name is Damon Embling. I'm a journalist with Euronews, and I'm going to be moderating this session over the next 60 minutes or so. And Euronews is pleased once again to be a media partner of WTM London this time around in 2020. I've got a great panel of guests lined up to discuss the future of aviation this afternoon during this session. Before I introduce them, I just want to set the scene really in the context for what we're going to be discussing over the next 60 minutes. Well, it goes without saying, doesn't it, that this year has been a tough one for the travel and tourism sectors, and the aviation sector in particular has been dealt a really devastating blow, with passenger numbers plummeting, aircraft having to be grounded around the world, and many airports resembling ghost towns because of the continuing travel restrictions and the lockdowns that we're seeing right around the world. It's pretty tough out there for airlines right now. But you're going to be hearing in the next 60 minutes that there is a glimmer of hope. We're going to be talking about some forecasts as to where the aviation industry is going to be going over the coming months and the coming years in terms of rebounding and recovering. It's not going to happen quickly, but it is expected certainly right around 2023. But what will the face of aviation be once it does get back to normal, if it can get back to normal? Because there's going to be lots of changing traveler behavior, traveler preferences, traveler mindsets that are going to influence the future of the industry. And if there are things like new taxes and also industry regulations, that could also shape the future of aviation. So how do airlines need to adapt? How are they going to survive? And what does the future look like? That's exactly what we're going to be discussing today. And if you have any questions for any of our panelists during this session this afternoon, all you need to do is click on the question mark in the video screen where you're watching, leave your question in there, and then we'll be able to get back to one of our panelists a bit later on during this session. I promise I'll get around to as many as we can. So, without further ado, let me introduce you to the great lineup of guests that I've got for this session. First of all, let's go to the UK, and we've got Dave Goodger, who's the Managing Director of Tourism Economics. Hello to you, Dave.
Hi, good afternoon, or good morning, wherever you're dialing in from.
Yeah, indeed. It is a good morning to Wendy Sowers, who's the Director of Market Forecasting and Analysis at Boeing Commercial Airplanes, because she joins us from Seattle in America. Good morning to you, Wendy.
Good morning, and good afternoon, good evening to everybody listening.
Great to have you with us. And Rami Al-Dashan, who's the head of UK and Europe sales at Virgin Atlantic. He also joins us from the UK today. Good afternoon to you, Rami.
Hi, Damon. Thanks very much for having me on the panel.
Looking forward to your contribution. And last but not least, let's go over to Geneva in Switzerland, and Andrew Matters, who's the Deputy Chief Economist with IATA, the trade body. Thanks for joining us, Andrew.
Thank you, Damon. Hello, everyone.
Welcome. Nice to see you there in Geneva. So before we get into the conversation proper, I'm going to hand the floor to David Goodger from Tourism Economics. He's going to give you an insight really as to where aviation might be going over the coming years with some forecasts that he's put together. So David, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the introduction there, Damon. Yes, so just a few short slides before forecasts based on our global macroeconomic forecasts. And in particular, we work with IATA on producing 20-year outlooks for air passenger flows. So starting with a near-term view, just want to confirm exactly what has been suggested already. We are seeing some unprecedented falls this year, looking at air passenger volumes for 2020 being less than half the size they have been in the previous couple of years. And yes, the recovery will not be immediate. You know, there's various steps that are needed in terms of, wide distribution of vaccine, economic recovery in travel confidence, but that recovery is expected. We do expect in our latest forecast, as we have done in all of our forecasts since the effects of the pandemic have become apparent, we do expect that recovery in demand. We do expect that to come recovery to 2019 levels by 2023 in our current outlook. But within that, there are going to be quite a lot of shifts. There are going to be some changes in traveller behaviour and the types of traveller, certainly in the immediate outlook. Simple terms, we expect domestic travel to be less affected and to recover more quickly than international. Within the international, we expect the short haul routes to recover faster than the long haul routes. And we do also expect some shift in the purpose of travel, the blows to business travel lingering that bit longer, leisure recovery coming more quickly. And obviously, there is a huge amount of uncertainty in the outlook still, unfortunately. You can see that, certainly my first slide showed that we have been revising our forecast regularly, and we've been revising forecasts more regularly than we would ordinarily do. And yet there is still a lot of uncertainty out there. This has shown a snapshot here of some alternative outlooks for GDP, which is a key determinant of what is going to happen in terms of travel demand and what's going to happen to air passenger flows. There's a lot of different factors at play here, including things such as the spread of the virus, timings of vaccine, other scientific measures, different therapeutics, which will then have further knock-on effects to travel demand as well through confidence effects. But I think the big picture here is essentially the sooner we get a recovery, then the less that long-run scarring will be. As economic impacts are prolonged, then we do expect to see the impact last longer into the outlook through factors such as unemployment, longer-run unemployment, impacts on incomes, financial positions, government debt, and so on. And then that means as well, as we then take a look at the longer run view, so showing here a snapshot of our 20-year outlook, there is still a lot of uncertainty out there. If we first off take a look over history, look over the last two cycles, back over the last 20 years, we can split that into two 10-year periods where growth in aviation was roughly comparable at around 6% on average per year. But we see that this growth was achieved for some slightly different reasons. There was still a strong contribution from income, from growth in GDP, from growth in population as well, and some other demographic factors within that relating to retirees having some income that they could spend. But growth was much faster than just those factors would explain. Slight differences in these, but changes in globalization, in air connectivity, in air liberalization in different markets had real impacts, notably through driving down price of travel, lower airfares, magnifying some of those income effects. As we then look to the forecast, so we're showing here our baseline view plus two alternative outlooks with faster scientific advances and then also a deeper recession outlook. We can see that there is some uncertainty there in incomes and what might happen with GDP. There's definitely some uncertainty around what's happening with population, demographics, possibly some reluctance to travel amongst older generation. But a real difference, certainly from the past and across these different scenarios, is what might happen with pricing related to some of these other factors of connectivity, liberalization, and notably what will happen with government policy. And we could see some differences in growth rate. And we do have to remember these growth rate differences will then translate to some very large differences in actual volumes of travel. And showing here, not necessarily a baseline and then a confidence interval around it. This is just sort of three possible outcomes, possible scenarios for the world, our baseline, plus a deep recession scenario, and then a scientific advances scenario, which does have those very different drivers in there. And it is unfortunately a much wider range of forecasts than we would like to present. On the downside, there is possibly a very gloomy view, but our baseline view is that there will be this return to growth, getting back up to over 7 billion passengers per year, but towards the end of the baseline outlook. And there is still some upside outlook that we could get back to a view of what we were looking at even just a year ago in our slightly more optimistic forecast. So plenty of uncertainty there and hopefully plenty for us to now move on to discuss. Back to you, Damon.
Dave from Tourism Economics, thank you very much indeed for that detailed insight into where the aviation industry might be going in the coming years. Clearly, there is some hope of a rebound and revitalization of the aviation sector, but clearly there's also this big word, there's the word of 2020, I suppose, uncertainty. Andrew Matters, let's go over to you in Switzerland at IATA. I was looking at a post that IATA put out on social media the other day saying the industry recovery has hit a wall. How are you going to get over that wall?
Well, that's the $64 million question at the moment, Damon. Certainly, the industry is in uncharted waters, and with the uncertainty, trying to manage all of this is incredibly difficult, incredibly challenging for the industry. It's certainly historically been the case that the industry manages shocks very well, right? And those shocks can be from a number of sources, whether it's natural disasters like volcanic ash clouds, for example, or terrorist attacks, economic factors, global financial crisis, for example. But this is different. This is unlike anything that we've seen, as Dave made clear in his presentation. So it's really a bit of a case of suck it and see, I think, for the industry. The airlines are trying to cut costs to try and get ahead of this because the demand has simply fallen away. There's a role for governments in all of this process as well. They've played an important part so far. That continues. But fundamentally, this is being driven by the pandemic. At its core, this is a fundamental health issue, and the pandemic keeps evolving, and that means that the airline industry and other industries need to keep adapting and adjusting to that situation as it evolves.
But Andrew, it's also highlighted, hasn't it, that the aviation sector was living on the edge. I mean, many airlines only had enough reserves in the bank for a few months. I mean, they were living on the edge, weren't they?
There was certainly a lot of airlines historically. Again, the industry has not traditionally made a lot of money. In the last 5 years, the performance of the industry was much stronger than we've seen historically. But that profitability in the last 5 years was really being driven by a relatively small number of airlines, only 20 or 30 airlines. Most airlines were sort of making a little bit of money, perhaps losing a little bit of money, but sort of managing to break even and continue. There was also a tail of airlines that were losing money, but there's a big chunk of airlines that were, as you said, struggling even before we got to this crisis. And they're the ones that are in real difficulty at the moment.
Reflecting on that point, let's go over to Rami at Virgin Atlantic, who joins us from the UK. Rami, you know firsthand how tough it's been for the airlines. Your airline had to negotiate a rescue package. You had hoped to get some government money in the UK. That didn't happen. You got a private deal in the end. Who would have ever imagined that Virgin Atlantic was facing, pardon the pun, such turbulence this year?
Yeah, I remember very well in February when we started talking about coronavirus. It was it was something that was happening far away from us. It was something happening over in Asia. It was seen very much as a localized issue, a bit like swine flu and other issues that are far more localized. I think what we've learned very quickly is the need to adapt and innovate, and how do we respond to things like this in the future? Because when you talk to people in the industry, there's real views that potentially this could happen again, and how do we adapt and improve as airlines to have fail-safes in place that we are prepared for whatever the future brings.
But Rami, you can talk about adaptation and sort of, moving forward in that sense. But, if things aren't going to get back to normal for sort of 3, maybe 4 years, if that, depending on what happens, all those uncertainties that Dave was talking about, how can airlines like yours survive?
I think it's it's all about a complete mindset change, Damon. It's all about learning to turn decision making around much quicker than we've ever done in the past. And my history of working at a variety of different airlines, particularly long haul airlines, has always taught me, let's put a new route on and leave it there for a couple of years and see what happens. Let's hopefully start making some money. I think going forwards, you'll see airlines expect to have cash positive flying instantly or as soon as possible. You'll see airlines change and adapt their schedule as and when the demand is there, rather than maybe historically saying, we are airline X, we fly to destinations A, B, and C. You'll see a lot more fluidity and a lot more quick change management in order to follow the money, as it were.
Okay, Rami, thanks for that for now. If you're just joining us on WCM London Virtual this year, of course, this session is called The Long Run Evolution of Aviation Activity Following the Coronavirus Pandemic. And if you do have any questions for any of our guests this afternoon, all four of them, then please do leave them in the question box that you can see on your video screen, and I'll be getting some of those to our panelists a bit later on over the course of this session. I'd like to go back to the US now, and Wendy Sowers, who's from Boeing Commercial Airplanes. Wendy, we've heard that it's really tough out there for airlines, but also there is this glimmer of hope for the future in terms of the rebound and recovery. What does this all mean for Boeing? Because, we've seen over recent weeks, over recent months, airlines retiring planes earlier than expected. For example, the 747, some are retiring the A380 sooner than expected. What does this mean for Boeing in terms of where you're going with aircraft orders?
Well, I think you're exactly right. The retirement wave is clearly been accelerated by what's going on today. But I would say, when we look back at prior crises, that's very typical, right? So if we go back to after 9/11, if we go to the great financial crisis, one of the things, Dave was showing earlier, the growth that we've seen over the last couple of decades, in some ways, there may have been even some pent up demand for retirements, because we had grown at over 6% in the last decade in terms of passenger traffic. So airlines were taking new airplanes, and because the demand was so strong, those new airplanes could come into the market and help the airlines make money. So as we've hit this downturn, which clearly is much bigger than anything we've ever seen before, in some ways there was actually some pent up demand. And I guess I would say the other thing there is the airplanes that we are seeing, parked today that aren't coming back into service to service the demand that is there, is typically what we see in any downturn. Is typically the older technology airplanes, the older ones, they're not as efficient. And therefore, those are the ones that we would expect airlines to retire in the long run. But then when the demand comes back, as Dave showed, we expect those newer airplanes to come back into service and serve the demand when we see the rebound.
And of course, this year, Boeing and Airbus, you've still been delivering new planes to airlines, right?
Yes, yes, we have. And that really gets to the fact that there's, we're replacing older airplanes to sustainability imperatives, those kinds of things. So we'll expect to see that go through. I think the other thing is that we tend to see, clearly we're at the, we're still in the crisis, but as we go through the next couple of years, and, Dave showed the fact that we expect different markets to come back at different rates. And so I think another layer of that is different airlines tend to grow and rebound faster depending on the value proposition they have in the marketplace. And so there'll be lots of variation, both in terms of markets, but in terms of the airlines themselves, depending on which markets they're serving.
Okay, Wendy from Boeing, thank you very much indeed for that. Let's go back to Dave Goodger from Tourism Economics, who's in the UK for us today for this session. Dave, you were mentioning in your presentation at the beginning that domestic travel is expected to rebound a lot faster than international travel. Can you elaborate on that and tell us actually what that means for the airlines?
Well, it is something that we have seen in prior downturns, and that this is something that we are looking to the past for lessons about the future, as we often do. But we are already seeing some of these things coming through that primarily for now, because there have been the travel restrictions in place. People haven't been able to travel internationally, at least not as easily. They have been taking more domestic travel options. This is notable around the world. China, US are clear examples, very large internal markets. People have returned to travel quite extensively within those countries. But even once the restrictions are starting to be lifted on international, we do expect that to continue to some extent, maybe not quite to have the same high shares of domestic travel, but there will still be that greater ease for travel, that greater confidence in travel domestically. Plus there is some of the price factors going on at play there. While people are feeling squeezed, budgets are being squeezed, people will return to travel to take the lower cost options, certainly at first, and we do expect that elevated proportion of domestic travel to continue over the next few years. And then I think one of the real interesting developments is the extent to which this is going to continue beyond that 5-year horizon. We think there'll be potentially some elevated share, but using our word of the day, there is that uncertainty, unfortunately, out there. And then some of that uncertainty, I think, will come down to what policies are put in place, how much the sustainability agenda really has risen, how much governments want to encourage people to take shorter trips, take trips closer to home, travel less, and also how much that is really happening on consumers' behaviour. I think we've already said it'll take some price shifts to really knock that consumer behaviour, but these things may have moved as a result of the pandemic, change of mindset.
Dave from Tourism Economics, thanks for now. Rami, let's go back to you at Virgin Atlantic, joining us from the UK as well. Dave, they're talking about the sort of faster rebound that's expected of the domestic market. Maybe people want to travel closer to home. Obviously, Virgin Atlantic is an airline that specialises in long-haul travel, particularly the transatlantic route, which has been hit hard by the pandemic. What does this mean in terms of your adaptation? And are you going to be thinking about route planning in a different way in the future?
Yeah, it's a great question, and one which we've seen absolutely the same messages coming as per Andrew's report. A little known fact: we're actually flying planes right now as Virgin Atlantic to Italy and to Germany. These are entirely cargo-filled planes. Historically, the way airlines and network planning have worked with relations to cargo is, hey, where do passengers want to fly? We'll probably be able to stick a bit of cargo on there as well to pick up as much revenue as we can. Actually, what the pandemic has meant is that cargo's got a much bigger seat at the table when it comes to network planning, and it's much more about where's the cargo going? Can we put some passengers on that aircraft as well? So, are we ruling out flying a short haul with wide-bodied aircraft? Absolutely not. I think everything has to be on the table in order to be as agile as possible, dealing through through what really are the thick of it of this crisis.
And Rami, how are you adapting your fleet? Because I was talking to Wendy from Boeing earlier on about some planes being retired earlier than expected, the 747, A380. I know that Virgin has been retiring planes and still taking new ones. How do you see the future of your fleet?
Well, we'll have by the end of the year, we'll have one of the youngest fleet in operation in terms of long haul. We're going to continue investing in new aircraft. We've got a fantastic fleet of 350s and 787s, and there'll be more of a reliance on that. There were quite a few tears shed when we said goodbye to our last 747. Very sad day for us and many other long haul airlines. But we understand, in order to stay relevant, in order to keep our consumers happy, we need to continue to invest in having the youngest fleet available. Okay,
let's go to Andrew Matters, IATA, who's in Switzerland for us today for this session. Andrew, nice to come back to you there. The problem with the airlines is that, yes, they've shed jobs and they're cutting costs in the short term, but a lot of their costs are sort of mid and long term, aren't they? So what does that mean in terms of the sort of short term survival, in terms of getting to that long term, gains in the future?
That's absolutely one of the challenges and one of the major pressures that are on airlines at the moment. What we've seen is, revenues largely evaporated. We have seen some recovery in demand, so airlines are starting to get some revenues coming in the door, and Rami noted the important role that cargo has played in that regard. But certainly, airlines haven't been able to cut costs as far as revenues have fallen, and it's because some of those costs are fixed or semi-fixed over the longer term. So airlines simply can't adjust. One of the implications of that is that on our latest estimates, we don't think airlines as an industry will be cash positive until 2022. Right? And so then if you think about how that translates in terms of profitability, and we'll be releasing some new forecasts on profitability in a couple of weeks, but our July forecasts, we we anticipated the industry would lose something like $84 billion this year, with another, albeit smaller, loss again next year. Now, because the recovery that we've seen hasn't been as strong as we anticipated or perhaps hoped for in July, I think that number is probably going to be revised down in a couple of weeks. So the industry could lose more than $100 billion in 2020 as a consequence of the pandemic. So that's a big hole to try to climb out of. Right? And airlines have been borrowing, so the debt burden has increased. That debt burden is going to continue for an extended period, and that's going to weigh on the financial performance of airlines as well. We know airlines that can go to the capital markets and borrow have been doing that. And we shouldn't forget the role of governments throughout this as well. But a lot of the government assistance has also come in, needs to be repaid, right? So that has added. So there's a lot happening here, which means that the industry overall is going to struggle financially for a number of years to come. And that's going to be an ongoing issue. There's simply no quick fix to that.
And Andrew, you mentioned the role of governments there. I mean, there have been lots of calls on governments for state aid. Some governments have been helping out airlines, some others not. And of course, this is all at the same time when governments are trying to balance lockdowns, travel restrictions, with trying to keep countries open for business, right? But at the end of the day, airlines can't run empty planes, can they?
That's the simple reality, right? Yeah. It just doesn't make sense. And as Rami said, previously an airline may have been willing to accept losses on a particular route in the hope of being able to build that market and then move into a positive financial position. Given the starting point now, that's a luxury that is not available to many airlines.
If I could just interject
Sure.
as well and add to Andrew's point, I think people think about this issue as being an airline issue in isolation, but actually, when the airline industry sneezes, everyone else catches a cold in the whole of the tourism ecosystem. If you think about how money trickles around the industry, we pay agencies, we get people into hotel beds, items such as the global distribution system and how money flows through that's all massively impacted. So we see a lot of these headline figures start with airlines, but it won't be long until you see really, really big effect with leisure and TMCs, travel agents that will be impacting probably from now for the next 6 to 12 months. You'll start seeing, unfortunately, businesses fold because of what's happening to the airline industry overall. Andrew,
do you want to add anything more on that?
I guess just to take that point a little bit further, this has implications for government finances as well, certainly in terms of government assistance. But as Rami pointed out, for many countries, the tourism industry and tourism revenues are critical for government revenues. So there's that knock-on effect there for government finances as well as what's happening in the industry too.
Yeah, wide-ranging effects in terms of all of those economic impacts and for the government impacts as well. Wendy, I'd like to go back to you at Boeing in Seattle in the US. I want to talk a bit more now about sustainability in the future, protecting our planet, the environment, all those sorts of things, which have been rising in prominence over the years. But I think even more so now, people have started to actually think about, in terms of their travel, consumers, about leaving a much more sustainable footprint. There's a lot of calls for the end of mass tourism and over-tourism. People saying that this is now a chance for regenerative travel, pressing that reset button. As an aircraft manufacturer, obviously you contributed to the sort of rise in travel and all of us flying all over the place. Is it time for Boeing to press the reset button, do you think?
So I think I come at that from a couple of different perspectives. When I think about air travel and airplanes, I think of it as part of the broad global transportation system that we have. And to your point, one of the things we saw after 9/11 with the increased time that it takes to go through security, after 9/11 and all of that, we saw some shifts in terms of where air travel really played a role and was the most value. So some of those shorter haul trips didn't make as much sense anymore, because by the time you spent the extra time at the airport, there really wasn't a time advantage. But there are, a lot of the trips around the world where air is the most efficient, and it is both from a time perspective as well as from an environmental perspective. And I think when we think about it at a broad global level, that's where airplanes really, play the role. And so I think that's the first piece, is the global transportation piece perspective. And then the second piece is, to your point, around sustainability and the things that the industry and we as a company are pursuing to make sure that we are as sustainable as possible, given the technologies that we have. And as I'm sure you've seen all across the industry, we have folks looking at new technologies. In particular, right now, the retirement of older technology that we were just talking about a little bit earlier is going to make a huge impact in the short term. And then the next piece that we're really focusing on is sustainable aviation fuels. So that contributes as well. And then as you go farther out, then you start looking at the technology answers that everyone is looking at across industries.
Okay, Rami, let's go back to you at Virgin Atlantic, talking about sustainability and the environment and the planet, all those sorts of things. Obviously, there has been stuff happening in the industry long before this pandemic hit, but is it fast tracking all of that now at an airline like yours?
Yeah, absolutely. I think airlines like ours kind of put carbon footprint into two big pots, and Wendy talked about it very succinctly around everything's being invested in alternative fuel, but the way in which airlines like ours are looking at innovating on board as well. So that piece of plastic that your headphones were wrapped in at Virgin Atlantic 2 years ago, now wrapped in the change option bag, so that you're saving, I think it was 20 tons of plastic a year. It's amazing how innovative airlines are being towards making small changes which make a big difference when you're thinking about the amount of capacity that's in the air at any one time. But it's also around, how are we using our space more efficiently? How are we ensuring that our load factors are at an absolute optimum, so that when we are traveling from point A to point B, we're being as efficient as possible, getting people where they need to go.
And that does mean turning to smaller aircraft, right? Smaller, fuel-efficient, greener aircraft.
Yeah, absolutely. I thought it was the journey of the A380 and the I still remember, I'm sure everyone does, the pomp and circumstance, the excitement when you had this behemoth that was going to take to the skies, and it's still exciting now, but you can see that trend disappearing and dissipating as actually really what we need is more of these sort of perfectly sized 350s or 787s, which are a lot more tactical and mean that we can expect load factors to be much higher.
But doesn't it cost more in the long run, though, because you have high load routes where the A380, the 747 did prove its worth? You can't get as many passengers on the smaller planes, right? Isn't it about bums on seats?
I think it's a great mix of both. I think there are routes which are designed perfectly for the likes of the A380, and those aren't necessarily limited to long haul. I've been on many a flight from Jeddah to Saudi Arabia when I lived into Riyadh when I lived in Saudi Arabia, where the A380s were absolutely full. So really, it's about using the right tool for the right journey. And the A380 is one. I think maybe the overexcitement of having such an aircraft and it being the of the moment aircraft to have, that's died down. And actually, we're seeing people be a lot more careful with their aircraft choices.
Okay, Rami from Virgin Atlantic, thanks very much indeed for now. To our audience, if you're just joining us, this is the long-run evolution of aviation activity following the coronavirus pandemic, a WTM London live event. My name is Damon Embling from Euronews, and I'm moderating this session. If you have any questions for any of our panelists, just a reminder, just click in the question box in the video screen where you're watching. We'll put some of those questions to our panelists during the next 30 minutes or so that we've got left. Look forward to hearing from you. Dave Goodger, let's go back to you in the UK at Tourism Economics. We've touched a little bit already in this session about changing traveller behaviour. And actually, when we look at the long-term future of the industry, traveller behaviour, preferences, mindsets are really going to be at the heart of this recovery, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of the key assumptions as we're looking forward is that we are going to get to see people wanting to return to travel in maybe not exactly the same way as before, but that return to propensity to travel as we have seen over the past. We do expect there to be some time for getting back there. Some of the confidence will take time to rebuild, but I think all of the the surveys, all of the indicators certainly point to the fact that people do want to travel. There is still a need for people to travel, a desire for people to go elsewhere on holidays. Also, as great as these virtual sessions are, there is still a real benefit for us, getting together in a room, and that there is that need for that face-to-face business travel as well.
Indeed, and I've heard so many people that say travelling is in everybody's DNA, and that's one of the reasons that travel will eventually pick itself back up. Andrew Matters at the IATA in Switzerland, I'd like to go back to you now. Obviously, changing traveller behaviour preferences, I was just touching on with Dave, will determine the kind of consumers and the customers that airlines are going to be getting in the future. How is the industry planning for that?
I think that's probably one of the ongoing uncertainties at the moment, Damon. We don't know exactly how these things are going to change and evolve, and what's going to be a lasting change versus a temporary change. So I think it's worth remembering. The real value of the air transport industry is not just in moving people and boxes from point A to point B, but it's those broader things. It's the way that the industry helps to facilitate trade and investment and jobs in other sectors, and the transfer of technology and I guess the experiences that the industry brings, and so I think that's important. I think when we think about the changes in behaviours, I think that's going to vary from market to market. It's going to vary across probably age cohorts as well. To be honest, I think Dave mentioned right at the outset that one of the question marks that we have is around the older age cohorts. They're the age groups that appear to have been most susceptible to some of these health issues. And even if we get through the COVID-19 experience, do they still behave more warily when it comes to travel, and not just air travel, but does their behaviour change in a longer lasting sense in that way as well? Business travel is interesting as well. When you think about the reasons that people travel for business, whether it's to visit clients, whether it's for internal meetings or conferences, those things are going to be impacted differently, right? There have been plenty of studies that show that there is a substantial benefit from having face-to-face engagement with clients. Those internal meetings, however, there's a big question mark around whether we need to go back to what we used to do in terms of traveling for internal meetings. So there's a lot of different nuances, even when you think about some of the key customer groups and the reasons for travel.
Yeah, I'm going to focus on business travel a bit more in a couple of moments. But first of all, I want to get back to Wendy Sowers at Boeing in Seattle. Wendy, both Dave and I think Andrew was mentioning there about this sort of confidence issue, because if the coronavirus pandemic does go next year, if there's a vaccine and it works and it helps to ease travel restrictions, there will be, won't there, a crisis of confidence? Because I know that airlines are out there reassuring passengers that getting on a plane is safe, and they talk about these HEPA filters that are filtering the air on the aircraft, all those sorts of things. Will those things go far enough in reassuring some people?
Yeah, well, I think that, everybody, we're talking about human psychology, so there's always a range. But I do think that when you look back at the technology that's built into airplanes, between the HEPA filters you're talking about, the fresh air coming in, the recirculation, all of those technology things that were already built into the airplanes, because we've been thinking about this for a long time, are really key. We're looking at additional technologies, so UV, cleaning solutions, all those kinds of things. So we're really putting a focus on that. I think it's also important to think about the full travel journey. So there is the time on the airplane, but there's all the movement through the airport. There's thinking about once you get to your destination, what's that like? So it really is, I think, the full transportation journey that folks need to think about. And I think that all of those elements play a role. But we're working a lot with the airlines, with the industry to help make sure these solutions are in place so that folks do feel comfortable. When they feel comfortable traveling again, they have the confidence to travel, and that the airplane is as clean as it possibly can be. And we're certainly seeing that. And I think maybe to offer a little bit of flavor to that I find very compelling. You know, a lot of the airlines have been out talking about the flight attendants that are on the airplanes, and they're flying every day, you know, for those people who do need to and are choosing to fly. And the incidence of COVID for those flight attendants that are on the airplane, a lot more than maybe you or I taking a trip here or there, are actually below the levels of the populations, you know, in which they're in. So I think that hopefully that gives folks confidence that the airplane itself is as safe as it possibly can be.
Rami at Virgin Atlantic, do you accept that there will be for some time this crisis of confidence as the market does look to rebound, that some people just will feel afraid of flying? And yes, you can hand them a sanitizer wipe and you can have your crew in masks, but for some people that might not be enough.
Yeah, I think we can show individuals pictures of people in hazmat suits, you know, with a toothbrush at toilets on aircraft, showing them how clean we can get it. But absolutely, how much of that permeates into the general public, and how much do they pick up on that versus their pre-aligned misconceptions? I think one piece which Wendy and Andy didn't pick up on is this piece around legislation. And actually, when we talk to passengers, whether it's leisure or business, their biggest fear is getting stuck somewhere. So actually, I think you'll see traveller perceptions change. So historically, the way people have picked where they're going to go on holiday is they've gone, where do I want to go in the world? And I'll go there and I'll see it at the best price. Whereas actually in the future, I think people think, where's the place I can go in the world that I can get what I want, but I'm sure I'll be able to get back, that has a track record of an air bridge that doesn't disappear and then reappear. So there's that element of the legal stability or the political stability between two countries will play a much bigger part in the resurgence of the industry, not just necessarily the hygiene impacts that my esteemed panel guest members were mentioning earlier as well.
Rami, stay with me because I want to. Oh, sorry. Yeah, carry on.
Sorry, Damon. Just very, very quickly adding to Rami's point. Some of the detailed surveys that IATA has commissioned has shown us that travellers are just as concerned about quarantine and travel restrictions as catching the virus when they travel. So it highlights the significance of Rami's point.
And Rami, while we talk about this sort of confidence around sort of flying in the future and booking travel and flying away on holiday, one of the questions that's come in from our audience says, do you think the airlines will be more flexible now in the future? For example, refunding immediately when the borders are closed from a certain country, because obviously travel restrictions can change at the last minute. We've seen that. And there has been controversy, hasn't there, around some airlines being slow to refund money and just throwing vouchers at people. And that really hasn't helped the confidence, has it?
No, absolutely. I think it will become something much more obvious in the zeitgeist of people making decisions on who they want to fly on than ever before. You know, people, rather than talking about what the food and what the in-flight entertainment is going to be, is how flexible and changeable is my ticket. So you're starting to see this trend emerging where airlines are waiving all their fare rules around flexibility and refundability. That prominent people in the US, such as Delta and American, are waiving all those rules that they've historically had on domestic flying. And you'll start to see that trend where carriers are making similar concessions elsewhere. Air France, KLM have done something very similar globally, where they've waived those restrictions of change fees and cancellation fees. And it's definitely a trend where people are saying, which carriers, I just want to see the carriers that have that flexibility, and then I'll decide out of that group. So it's a trend which is emerging, which we need to grab hold of as an industry.
And Andrew, at IATA, do you think the industry is willing to be flexible?
Absolutely, Damon, absolutely. I mean, I think we shouldn't forget there's also a third player in this conversation as well, right? There's the traveller, there's the airlines, and airlines absolutely are rethinking what they can do and what they need to do to respond to the travellers' needs. But the third party in this is the governments. It's the governments that are setting the travel restrictions and the quarantine requirements and those sorts of things as well. So, you know, it's obviously a complex process and a difficult decisions to make, but we shouldn't forget the role of that third party in all of this.
And Andrew, I would probably add a fourth as well. I've talking to travel agents has been fascinating during this period, because as they've seen their average travel consultant booking, you know, 90% less tickets, they're still saying that particularly at the beginning of the pandemic, they were still busier, if not more busy than ever. So because agents are set up to make bookings, sell you a ticket, and then move on to the next one. I think in the future, in order to help us adapt to the future, they need to get much better at helping customers make changes and adapt to, you know, borders opening and closing. So I think agents have a really important part to play as well.
Because it feeds into this uncertainty word again, doesn't it? Because if travellers aren't certain that they can travel somewhere, and they're not certain they're going to get their money back, that's going to put them off, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Dave, have you got anything to add on that? Or?
Largely, that's it's all supporting the view that we're seeing in the forecast. We're absolutely, you know, seeing that, you know, like I said, within the international travel up front, you know, people will favour the short haul first, and it comes down to these factors, you know, these known destinations, places where you got confidence in travel, places where you know you're going to get home. It's something we've seen after, you know, other incidents, terrorist attacks, natural disasters. People do have that switch and favour the shorter haul known destinations. It's something that we will see, no doubt, lasting a bit longer this time, unfortunately. I think that the one other point I think related to this will be in terms of there might be some shift away from some really well-known destinations, as people will still try to avoid the crowds, and this, you know, is going to be an interesting dynamic. Some of the places that were really complaining about the over-tourism now really seeing the benefits that tourism does bring to their destinations, and it is that real chance for a rethink, and whether people will want to come back in those numbers, and whether these destinations want to accept people back in those numbers, or continue to divert them and manage those flows to some of the smaller destinations within countries.
Because Dave, we're talking about today revitalising and sort of getting the industry back to where it was pre-pandemic, but actually some people would say, should it go back to the levels that it was? I mean, it feeds into this whole sort of over-tourism sustainability issue that travellers are thinking about, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, we've touched on it already, that I think there's, you know, the pandemic itself is not bringing about that many changes of itself. It's accelerating a lot of things that were already, you know, out there in the market. And it was, people were starting to, you know, reconsider, you know, how much they were wanting to visit these, you know, real over visited places. Some places maybe not quite as many as would be suggested by some of the headlines, but there's certainly some destinations, some cities we're receiving huge volumes of travel. Unfortunately, seeing the flip side of that now, but we do think that we'll come back somewhere in between. Be greater. We're seeing that shift more towards destination management rather than just pure destination marketing.
And of course, the issue of seasonality and levelling out seasons is a big part of that debate as well, as the travel and tourism sectors look to the future. And Wendy, I haven't forgotten you. I want to go back to you at Boeing in Seattle in the US. Welcome back into the debate. We were just touching there on sustainability, and we talked about the green issues a bit before in this session as well. But we just had a question in from a member of our audience that I want to fire off at you. This person is saying, how will COVID affect airlines' abilities to fund upgrades of fleets in order to achieve zero carbon emissions by the 2050 target?
Yeah, so I think it really has a lot of the elements that we were talking about before. So it's over a time horizon. So today, right now, what you're seeing is some of those older technology fleets be retired, or plans for retired, not coming back when we get to the other side of the COVID, the health crisis piece of things. So that's the first step. Sustainable aviation fuels are also a key portion of that here in the near term. And I think that's one, you know, we've been talking a lot about the role of governments. When we talk about aviation fuels, there's an investment piece to get the pricing to similar levels to current jet fuel. And so that's certainly a policy place where, or, you know, a role where the governments can play to accelerate or increase the use of the sustainable aviation fuels within the industry. And then, as we're seeing once again across industries, I think, it's the longer term technologies. One of the things I think I would offer here is, in terms of fuel efficiency for this industry over the long run, because of a lot of the cost pressures we've just been talking about, fuel is typically, sometimes labor, but in a high price situation, fuel is one of the biggest cost items for an airline, hands down, right? So there has always been a big drive to increase the fuel efficiency and the efficiency of the fleet overall. And I think that will continue to be part of it. And I think the positive for the industry in general is that cost imperative is lined up with the sustainability imperative that we're talking about here.
Okay, thank you very much indeed for that. Andrew at IATA, I just want to go back to you with another question that we've had in from our audience saying, what model of aviation is best suited to the new climate? Budget carriers or legacy airlines like BA or Singapore Airlines?
Wow, that's a great question. Unfortunately, I don't think there's a simple answer to that, because I think, airlines of all types, regardless of your business model, are really suffering at the moment, right? In terms of the financial impact and the impact on demand. So this is industry wide. It's not focused more on one business model or another. When we think about the recovery, there's some interesting questions there as well. Some could argue that initially the airlines with the lowest cost are probably in a better shape to be able to manage the crisis. Some would argue that they are more flexible, more agile, more innovative than other airlines. But I think that's a generalization, right? Because I think different airlines are applying their trade in different markets with different customers, and what those customers want and need differs. So the secret to success is not so much the business model, it's how the airline is able to respond to what its market, to what its passengers want. And that's the airline that's going to be successful in any market, regardless of its business model.
And Andrew, I just want to keep you there actually for another question that we've had in from the audience saying, has there been a difference in the regional approach to aviation in the COVID climate? And if so, why have certain models been more successful than others?
Again, I don't think we can generalize and say that some business models have performed better than others. There are some low-cost carriers which are in critical financial condition, just as there are some hybrid or the full-service carriers. So this is impacted industry-wide. Partly it depends on the state of finances going in, but to the crisis, but it also depends very much on the markets, the individual markets, and how they have been impacted and how that airline is positioning itself to be able to respond. I guess the other thing we shouldn't forget is that in every crisis, including this crisis, there are opportunities. And those opportunities are going to come to some incumbents who will be able to adapt and take that opportunity. But I think there's also some opportunities for airlines which didn't exist before the pandemic to gain a bit of a toehold in this current situation. And so I think that's going to be a really interesting element to watch in the next little while.
Okay, Andrew. Rami at Virgin Atlantic, I want to go back to you, put you on the spot with a question from our audience. We talked a bit earlier, didn't we, about flexibility and sort of boosting confidence in terms of that for travellers wanting to book flights. This person is asking, the flexible airfare is priced higher, making it prohibitive to book. Do you anticipate airlines will reevaluate their pricing structures? Pricing was going to come into this, wasn't it?
Absolutely. I think it's a really good point, and something that's being driven by NDC and new distribution capabilities. Historically, airlines have only had 26 booking classes in the GDS because that's how many letters there were in the alphabet, right? So we've got these archaic systems in place, which have meant that we've allowed more flexible as you go up that booking ladder. I think what you'll see from long-haul airlines like ours will be adapting the way we do pricing to very much match the way low-cost carriers work, where we'll say you can buy a ticket and then you can have a bolt-on for that extra flexibility insurance, and it's going to cost you no more than X% of the amount that you've spent on a ticket. But to go to Andrew's point, you know, I think what you'll see from low cost versus long haul is that we're all going to be stealing ideas off each other in the short to medium term. So a lot of long haul sort of legacy airlines will go, what works for short haul? Ancillary sales, you know, a little flex ups for additional flexibility. And low cost carriers will be saying, I want those high yield tickets that I've never had before. So how do I appeal more to the business traveler? So you'll see that speeding up and that coming together a lot more going forward.
Okay, Rami. Wendy, I want to go back to you at Boeing because we're running out of time. We've got about 5 minutes left. I just want to talk about what the future face of the industry is going to be emerging from the coronavirus pandemic over the next few years. Are you expecting a lot of consolidation at Boeing, that you're going to be selling aircraft to less airlines in the future?
You know, I think that gets to a little bit to the point that Andrew was making just a bit ago, which is in any downturn like this, we see a little bit of everything, right? We see existing incumbents adapting and coming out looking a little bit different. And certainly fleets are probably going to look different as we come out of this crisis, given the depth and the breadth and the magnitude of it. But we also, it has amazed me over the last couple of months, all the discussions I've heard around startups. One of the effects of what we're seeing today is there are a lot of airplanes available potentially coming out of existing fleets. There are potentially pilots and other folks who help, you know, make the operations go every day. And as a result, we're seeing folks talk about, okay, I've got this great idea. This market might be underserved, or we think we can serve it in a different way. And so there's a lot of discussion around startups as well. And given the economic environment and where interest rates are globally, those kinds of things, I think what we're going to see is a lot of innovation coming through this, as we typically do. So it's going to be a little bit of everything, honestly, I think.
And Dave Goodger, let's have a final thought from you from tourism economics. I mean, we have been headed around the world for more liberalisation of the skies, weren't we? How do you think liberalisation is going to be impacted by this?
Well, in a simple sense, I think it won't be impacted. I think, you know, our view is it's carrying on as we have been. You know, yes, there was the upward trend of liberalisation, as there was an upward trend in globalisation. Much as globalisation now seems to have plateaued, you know, it's not going away. We're not going to see complete, you know, renationalisation of supply chains or complete regionalisation of supply chains. There is still going to be global trade. There is still going to be the level of liberalisation. There's absolutely upside opportunities. Very much differs by region. You know, you can look to Africa as real opportunities from more liberalisation. But no, we can't expect to see the same extent as we have seen over the past 10, 20 years. There will be that slight upward pressure on prices for that, but you know, as we've heard, there's a lot of moving parts going on in prices as well that would balance out some of these moves.
Okay, thanks, Dave. Andrew, let's go back for a final thought from you, IATA in Switzerland. As you look to the future, obviously what's going to happen in the short term will also help to determine the long-term future of the aviation industry. You know, there's news out today of a potential vaccine that's buoyed the market, certainly, including some aviation companies today. You know, what is the key to unlocking the long-term future of the aviation industry now? What do you want to see happen?
Yeah, you know, I think in the long term, once we get through this current crisis, you know, the normal demand drivers are going to reassert themselves, and you know, that's around economic growth and activity and income as being a very important driver. And as Dave spoke about, the liberalisation issue as well. I think growth over the longer term. The exciting place to be looking is in some of those large emerging markets. There's a lot of upside opportunity for air passenger demand in those markets, and that's where I'd be keeping a close eye.
Rami, just want to come back to you because we are running out of time. I want to finish on a question from one of our audience there. Well, this is one that we could have expected. What would be your advice for university students who are preparing for careers in the aviation industry?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and the future of our industry is going to be around the around the analytical elements. I think really my advice would be speak to people in the industry, understand what's going on, keep abreast of what's going on, but also look at career paths like the OR and analytical elements, because that's where the future of aviation is. Unfortunately, we're going to de-glamorize it all and make it into numbers. So the quicker you can pick up on those numbers, the better.
Okay, Wendy at Boeing in Seattle, final word from you, just briefly.
Well, I guess my perspective, having been through a couple of downturns in this industry, is when we're in the midst of the crisis, which I would say we probably are at the moment still, sometimes it's hard to see the longer term. But as we look back, we have seen the resilience that Dave had at front in the charts that he showed. And we need to be planning for that now, because we're a long cycle business. And so the road to recovery is there. We need to be planning for it, and just need to make sure we don't get too focused on the near term. It's important. We got to work through it, but also make sure we keep that long-term perspective in mind.
Well, that's a good point to finish this session. Wendy Sowers from Boeing Commercial Airplanes in Seattle. Thank you very much indeed for joining us today. Dave Goodger, Managing Director at Tourism Economics, joined us from the UK. Thank you very much indeed for your contribution. Rami Al-Dashan is the Head of UK and Europe Sales at Virgin Atlantic. He also joined us from the UK. Thank you very much indeed for your contribution. And last but not least, Andrew Matters, who's the Deputy Chief Economist at IATA. He joined us from Switzerland. So for all of you watching, I hope you found that a very insightful session about where the aviation industry is going in the short, medium and long term. There clearly is evidence of hope and a glimmer of hope that things will get back to the levels that we saw previous to this year. But clearly the face of the aviation industry and traveller preferences will be changing over the coming years. Thank you very much indeed for watching this WTM London live virtual session. We'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.